Magneto ripping every inch of adamantium from Wolverine's bones was one of the darkest scenes from X-Men 97, but worse than that was Gambit's death in the 5th episode at the hands of the Sentinels. But if you thought that was the end of Gambit in X-Men 97, I'm here to tell you, you're probably wrong. You see, not only is Gambit set to return in Season 2, he's coming in a form that will absolutely terrify you down to your very bones, and that's what we're here to talk about today. In fact, we believe the second season will be adapting the infamous and dark fate that Gambit befell in X-Men Volume 2, issues 181 through 187, where Apocalypse got his hands on the most Cajun mutant ever. In the first season, we saw how Gambit's heart was left broken by Rogue, who chose Magneto over him, and although she later decided to ditch Magneto, thinking that love runs deeper than skin, Gambit never found out about that. And then, the Sentinels arrived on Genosha, and Gambit valiantly sacrificed himself in order to destroy the biggest one. But in the post-credit scene of the 10th episode, we see that Apocalypse has returned to Genosha, where Gambit lost his life. His apparent grave picks up one of Gambit's cards. Now, it's been confirmed that the show will continue in 3 different timelines, one of which is the ancient past of 3000 BC, another the distant future of 3960 AD, and one in the present, which is actually the 90s? From what I think and know, the current timeline will feature Gambit in his new and deadly form, of course, after Apocalypse resurrects him and transforms him into one of his horsemen of death. And in this video, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. His new form, what it might look like, and how he may become one of the deadliest bad guys in Season 2 of X-Men 97 using the comics as a blueprint. It's going to be a good one, so let's get into it, shall we? Gambit had been sidelined much before Apocalypse made the offer he couldn't refuse. X-Men Volume 2, issue 181 begins in the aftermath of M-Day, where most mutants had lost their powers or simply perished, and only a few X-Men and 198 others retained their powers, so the roster was depleted, and even heavyweights like Storm, Polaris, and Havoc were gone. Facing mutant extinction once again, the X-Men needed every powered mutant they could get, which is why when Mystique showed up, Cyclops agreed to find her a place in the X-Men's ranks. Of course, this is where the problems begin for Gambit. You see, his fall from grace started at the Xavier Institute, and it started with Mystique, Rogue's adoptive mother and Gambit's kinda sorta mom-in-law figure, but she didn't return to the team alone. She came with Augustus, also called Pulse, who one could say was her partner in crime. Mystique's intent here was to ensure that Rogue was paired with him, thereby sidelining Gambit, and as one might expect, Remy reacts very harshly to the notion. He obviously wants Mystique gone, and snaps when Cyclops backs her probationary status, and as a result, he pulls away from Scott as if the team itself has become something he no longer trusts. But to be fair, Scott couldn't make his decisions based on the romantic feelings that members of the team shared, but the Cajun mutant couldn't see that at all. This wasn't even the first time Mystique had done something like this either, as earlier she had tried to split Gambit and Rogue by infiltrating the school under another identity, after which she tried to seduce Gambit. Can you even imagine how far a sociopath like Mystique would go to make sure her daughter wasn't hanging around with men she didn't like? And despite Mystique pretty consistently betraying everybody around her, Cyclops effectively tells Gambit that he's gonna have to live with it. In the next issue, 182, Gambit's wound is cut further open, and some might say so deep that it should have left the poor guy's heart bleeding dry. Rogue meets Pulse and tells him straight that she and Gambit are happy and that Pulse has no chance with her. Then he proceeds to keep his hand on her arm, and Rogue asks him to stop, saying, "Mister, I wouldn't put your hand there," to which Pulse asks, "You gonna slap a suit on me for sexual harassment?" Rogue explains that touching her would mean that she takes away his life force, but Pulse tells her that she shouldn't worry about that. Intriguingly, we actually learn what he meant there from a conversation between Mystique and Gambit during one of their boxing matches. Raven Darkholme explains to him that Pulse's powers are disrupting the powers of other mutants by creating an electrical field, and it has something to do with his eyes, which basically means that Pulse can hold Rogue, kiss her, and touch her in ways that Remy cannot. Now, if you'll remember, Gambit and Rogue were in a similar situation in X-Men 97 Season 1, just that there it was Magneto whose electric field manipulation could disrupt Rogue's powers. In fact, Rogue and Magneto had a very complicated history there, one that ended with them in bed a number of times. But then, Rogue saw that Magneto already had a lot of trauma, and between her baggage and his, there was no space for their relationship to bloom, so in the end, she was going to ditch Magneto and go with Remy, but she never got that chance, sadly. Coming back to the comic though, Mystique then asks Gambit whether he loves Rogue enough to let her have her quote-unquote real happiness with someone else. Needless to say, the book is basically putting Gambit's deepest romantic insecurity right in front of him while making him stare at it. I mean, everyone has needs, right? And Loverboy Gambit knows that better than anybody, as it's something that's always haunted him. As we mentioned earlier, even Gambit's argument with Scott about Mystique's inclusion on the team ended in withdrawal instead of a resolution. So, when Apocalypse later tells Gambit that he's been pushed aside and no one listens to him anymore, Apocalypse wasn't just making stuff up. He was actually poking a very real bruise and digging into it to make it worse, pushing Gambit over the edge and into his villain era. For the greater good. Now, one thing we want to clarify is that for Gambit, Apocalypse wasn't the villain we know him as. In fact, Gambit thought that Apocalypse might just be the savior that a very weakened mutant kind needed right now. And Saba Nur had awoken in Egypt, furious over what had happened to mutant kind. He talks about helpless mutants slaughtered across the world, and he says that the collapse of mutant numbers after M-Day pulled him out of his slumber, and that's precisely why he calls himself Salvation while he hovers over Xavier's grounds in issue 183 instead of presenting himself as a conqueror like he usually does. He tells the mutants that their pain woke him up and that all he asks in return is complete loyalty. I mean, yeah, this all still reeks of control, of course, but it's control that comes coated in a paint of safety, especially at a moment when mutant life appeared to be shattered. But once Apocalypse's plan truly comes to light, you can't help but feel that he's once again up to his regular shenanigans. So Apocalypse wants Pestilence's plague, and the only antidote to the diseases that Pestilence would spread would be his very blood, which he would, of course, only give to mutants. And this way, he would be able to reduce humanity to a meager 10% of their current number. And I mean, since after M-Day the mutants were roughly at that same population level, it kinda made sense. Once Apocalypse had reduced humanity's numbers to be proportional with that of mutants, he planned to let them fight and let this final struggle decide which species deserved the Earth. His motivation, as usual, was survival of the fittest. His servant, Ozymandias, urges him to just kill all the humans and be done with it, yet Apocalypse rejects that because, in his view, mutants must still prove that they're worthy of rule rather than receiving the world as a gift. It's hideous logic by all accounts, and the story never even pretends otherwise, but in the context of the story, it kind of feels like a ruthless response to a catastrophe, kind of like Thanos' plan to reduce half the universe's population in order to save it. And honestly, that's a key thing to remember here. The mutants are desperate, and when Gambit concedes to join Apocalypse, he's not drawn towards a clownish villain speech, rather he's drawn towards a perverse form of hard certainty at a time when certainty is in short supply. Gambit walks into Apocalypse's Sphinx, and Apocalypse says that he expected him, and Remy admits that until moments earlier, he wasn't sure he could go through with it. To make it easier for Gambit, Apocalypse paints the choice in emotional terms and basically says that Gambit felt he had to do something, and the only way to do that was through joining the Egyptian Mega Mutant. By doing so, Apocalypse was playing with Gambit's sense of duty, his frustrations, while building a sense of urgency. All of this would make it easier for Remy to commit himself when Apocalypse asked him to murder or torture people. Basically, Apocalypse was brainwashing Remy, asking him to do these things for the greater good. The choices inside the Sphinx. The conversation between the two men is short, but it says almost everything. Apocalypse speaks to Remy in French, which surprises him, and then Apocalypse claims that he not only speaks all the languages on Earth, but that he speaks Gambit's language in a deeper sense as well. He reminds Remy that he used to believe that humans and mutants could still live together, and our boy Gambit admits he once believed it too. Now, though, he says these dark days demand darker methods. He also says he no longer seems to be heard, and Apocalypse answers that others fear listening to him. When Gambit says he's been relegated, Apocalypse flatters him by saying that he's been pushed down because he's better than the others. Now, we've seen a number of recruitment strategies, especially in comic books, but none that used fear. None that used someone's wounded pride. After this comes the pact, in the most literal sense of the term. Usually, employers ask you to sign an offer letter, and bad guys in fiction ask you to pledge your allegiance to them, but not Apocalypse. He's built different. This guy hands Gambit a test tube of his own blood and proposes a mighty partnership and a new world. Remy drinks the blood, and the book really doesn't soften this strange pseudo-cannibalistic, pseudo-vampiric moment. As far as Remy is concerned, it's a choice, and it's a real one. But more importantly, Remy sees this as something he has to and must do on behalf of mutant kind. He doesn't see it as some selfish revenge kind of thing, but we also know that he's lying to himself because a big part of why he's here is because he feels cheated and sidelined by his former allies. I'm not going to say that his reasoning excuses his actions, but it does help explain them. And then, in issue 184, things change from choice to conversion, and this is also where the story gets much, much nastier. Gambit was in Apocalypse's transformation machine and refused to take the painkillers. Apocalypse warns him that the agony ahead would be immense and offers relief for it, so much so that he even puts aside the juice of Thoth when Remy insists he has to remain conscious for the entire process. He wants to know what Apocalypse is doing to him and asks about one of the machine's pincer-like devices, aka the Claw of Horus, and Apocalypse admits that the machine almost has a life of its own and that even he isn't fully sure of what every part of it does. Needless to say, this isn't the controlled science that we were expecting, since Apocalypse himself doesn't know how half this shit works, and clearly, Remy was putting himself into a potentially lethal and unpredictable mechanism that even its master doesn't completely understand. And then, the machine begins its dark work. Tiny mechanisms burrow through Gambit's back towards the hieroglyphs of his spinal cord, and during that torment, Apocalypse and Ozymandias keep trying to tell Remy what his quote-unquote real motive is. Ozymandias says Gambit joined them because he's come to hate the X-Men, while Apocalypse pushes harder and harder, and then harder still. He says the team treated Remy like rubbish, that someone with his unique heritage should by all logic have led the X-Men, and that resentment is nothing to feel ashamed of. If you're only skimming this arc, it's easy to stop there and say, right, bitter Gambit sold out, but the issue doesn't stop there. You see, underneath this pain, Remy rejects their version of him, like he's still trying to remain himself while being transformed into something else entirely. You get my drift? I mean, he says he's not doing this because he hates the X-Men, and he tells his new master that he's doing it because he loves them. Furthermore, he tells Apocalypse that he almost believes this changed version of Apocalypse, that M-Day seems to have brought out the best in him, and that mutants need his strength now. Even then, Remy casts himself as a watcher at this time, as much as he sees himself as a recruit of Ensaba Nur. Now, if Apocalypse is lying, scheming, or ready to fall back into his old self-serving mode, Gambit says that he'll be there to see it and act against Apocalypse himself. But the question of if Gambit's strong enough to check Apocalypse still remains. Either way, Apocalypse hears all of this, walks away, and then privately tells Ozymandias that the creature who will come out of the machine will not be the man who entered it. The Gambit would forget all that he used to be after the procedure had been completed. Clearly, issue 184 removes all doubt and establishes that Apocalypse was still the piece of shit we know him to be. The machine that made death. When the X-Men reached Apocalypse in issue 184, the Fourth Horseman was no longer a rumor. Rogue looks up and sees Gambit on Apocalypse's team as Death, and she's taken aback. Interestingly, the issue's character list identifies him as Death 6, while Gazer was named War 5, Sunfire was Famine 4, and later, Polaris was named Pestilence 5. When we reach the 185th issue, Rogue calls out to Remy, but Death knocks her down and plants himself over her. Indifferent, cold, and deadly. His eyes are blood red, and he gives her zero emotional response, extremely unlike Gambit. Seeing this, Iceman had to tell Rogue that this isn't Gambit anymore, and Havoc backs him up. And for the first we see of Death, this really feels true. I mean, this guy is present in body alright, but the thing is that Gambit is absent from his heart, that is, if he has a heart at all. Death is also stronger, meaner, and equipped with new weapons that good old Apocalypse taught him how to use. When Rogue later pleads with the man she loves to come with her, Death insists that he's not Remy anymore. Apocalypse orders him to use gas on Rogue, and Death obeys. Later, when Apocalypse threatens him in private, Remy warns that he can flood Apocalypse's lungs with noxious gas too, with that being the first sign that maybe, just maybe, there was still a little bit of Remy left in there. In issue 187, he uses another version of that gift against Havoc and Iceman when he clogs their bronchial tubes with mucus for 20 minutes. Looking at all this, it becomes clear that Apocalypse has altered what Remy can do and how he fights. But you know what? Rogue's appeals and requests still held some value for Death. After the X-Men escape the Sphinx in issue 185, Death tells Apocalypse that the fog in his mind has begun to thin, and he can see now that he's still Remy LeBeau. Still Gambit, and that part of him loves Rogue. Hearing this, Apocalypse grabs Death by the throat and insists that Death doesn't love because Death is a force of nature, like a flood or a storm, and threatens to put him back in the transformation machine for adjustment. You'd be right to think that Apocalypse was now alarmed and kind of worried about what he had created, and was wondering if there was some kind of flaw in his Death design. To drive that point home, Remy answers Apocalypse's words with a threat of his own and forces him to let go. And for us, this scene has an immense amount of value. It was huge because it proved that although Death was active in Remy's body, Remy was still very much alive and was beginning to push back. But then, Apocalypse saw the folly in his grand plan and begins to shorten Death's leash. In issue 186, before the final battle in the Sphinx, Death reports that he cannot find Ozymandias. Apocalypse punches him and reminds him that he planted something called the Achilles heel in his flesh in case he ever chose betrayal, which is a blatant reminder of the fact that even after the conversion, Apocalypse never fully trusted him. He knows what he's built, and he knows it's unstable. Death then reaches his lowest point when he stands beside Apocalypse at the United Nations. There, Apocalypse explains that the antidote from his own blood can no longer save enough humans, so the world's leaders now have a week to kill 90% of humanity themselves or face the plague of pestilence. When Apocalypse turns to Death for confirmation, Death backs him. He says that the X-Men don't understand how times have changed. Death against Rogue and the X-Men. The other Horsemen of Apocalypse around Death help him frame where his arc goes next. Gazer has already been remade into war, Polaris has become pestilence, and Sunfire has been turned into famine and left in terrible shape, yet Emma Frost says his subconscious fought Apocalypse the whole way through, so much so that nobody can yet tell how much of Sunfire still survives or whether he'll live. At least that tells us that Gambit is never alone inside this structure. He's one of several former X-Men, and one of those former X-Men already proves that Apocalypse's control can crack from the inside. Trust us, that's going to be important real soon. Issue 186 pushes this point even further. During the assault on the Sphinx by the X-Men, the New Avengers, and the new Sentinel units, Death has several strange moments. When Apocalypse admires the enemies who keep forcing their way back into the fight, Death asks War whether Apocalypse has lost his mind. Then, in the same breath, he insists that Death speaks the truth and that he is, without doubt, Death. And I mean, that's kind of this story in a nutshell. One part of Death questions, another part doubles down as if the question itself made him nervous. He remains deeply indoctrinated, but the fact that he's able to step outside the role for even a second tells you that the role is no longer sealed shut. Then, the battle tears Apocalypse's camp apart. Ozymandias turns on War and kills him over an old debt. Pulse neutralizes Apocalypse's powers for a moment, Sunfire blasts Apocalypse, and the X-Men close in amid that rupture. Rogue still tries to reach Remy, but it's Death who answers, enough so that Mystique kicks him away and warns Rogue not to be fooled. When Apocalypse flees deeper into the Sphinx, Sunfire does something that looks strange, but the comic later explains it. Instead of sticking with the X-Men, he picks up Remy and leaves with him. Rogue is forced to deal with her loss twice over, first when Remy became Death, and then when he was taken out of reach again the moment Apocalypse's control started to splinter. The aftermath is all about the ensuing melancholy. Rogue can't understand why Sunfire took Remy, and Havoc admits none of it makes sense anymore. Later, back at the mansion, Rogue tells Pulse that she dreamed Remy was trying to find his way back to the Institute, but kept getting lost. Honestly, we loved this development because it says in one image what the whole arc was doing to Gambit. You see, he hasn't vanished, he's still somewhere inside the maze, it's just that he simply can't find the road home. After Apocalypse lost his grip. Issue 187 opens far from Westchester, in a Japanese Zen temple, and that's where Gambit's post-apocalypse phase truly starts. Sunfire tells him to stop resisting and argues that they need to kill Apocalypse, though he quickly explains that he means to kill their attachment to him as master. At first, Gambit hates that idea, and he points out that Apocalypse gave Shiro his legs back and gave Remy back his own sense of purpose. In perhaps the clearest statement of why Apocalypse's grip on him was so tight, Remy says Apocalypse put the meaning back into his life and gave him the spark that helped him leave the X-Men. Sunfire counters and says that from the beginning, Gambit had doubts and was a half-formed horseman at best, while Remy insists that those doubts were gone, and this argument is great because both men are right in different ways. Sunfire also tells him that there's one more like him and that they need to find her. He means Polaris. That sends the pair towards Xavier's school. When they enter the mansion, Gambit backs Sunfire without hesitation. He says Polaris is one of them, so she belongs with them. Rogue confronts him again because she's the greatest attachment to his old self, but then he attacks her, smashes her into a wall, and uses Apocalypse's gas against Havoc and Iceman. Pulse weakens him long enough for Rogue to hit him, so yeah, Remy had begun to break away from Apocalypse, but the form that break takes is ugly. He tries to sever his past by force. At the same time, the book still lets the old Remy leak through in warped form. Sunfire realizes Polaris isn't one of them in the way he imagined because Lorna rejects belonging to anybody at all. He grabs Gambit and escapes through the window, and later, back at the temple, Gambit circles back to the Zen line that annoyed him earlier and says he finally understands it. Apocalypse, Rogue, and the X-Men are all things he's now free from. Sunfire says that this leaves them free to decide what comes next. And then, the arc ends with Mr. Sinister stepping out of the shadows and telling them that he is their future. That's where this arc leaves Gambit. He's essentially cut loose from Apocalypse, cut loose from his home, and immediately claimed by another manipulator. Why his new form could terrify everyone. Gambit as Death is scary because Remy LeBeau was already an extremely dangerous person before Apocalypse got to him. Normal Gambit can charge objects with kinetic energy and turn a playing card into a tiny disaster with style, charm, and his very annoying habit of looking the absolute coolest while doing it. So, when Apocalypse takes that power and twists it into something colder, more poisonous, and more corpse-like, the idea becomes far more disturbing. This isn't exactly a new power set as much as it's a corrupted old one. That's why Death Gambit could terrify everyone in X-Men 97 Season 2 if the show does take this route. Remy's usual look has romance baked into it. The coat, the cards, the eyes, the smile, the whole "I know I'm trouble, but you like me anyway" routine. But as Death, all of that can be inverted. He could be pale, red-eyed, armored, and almost undead, like the same charming human thief turned into a bad sign in human form. And the worst part is that his powers don't need to change beyond recognition. They only need to feel more cruel. Instead of bright kinetic energy and clever card tricks, his abilities should feel poisonous, explosive, and related to decay. Basically, Apocalypse took the showman and turned him into a warning. But if the story really wants to hit home, Rogue has to be the emotional center of it. Season 2 doesn't need Gambit back just so he can throw cards and fight people. We've got enough action in this universe. What it needs is Rogue seeing Gambit alive after his apparent death, only to realize that the man in front of her isn't really Remy anymore. That's real heartbreak. Imagine Rogue finally getting the miracle she wanted, and then that miracle looks at her with dead eyes. Worse, imagine he remembers her, but the memory doesn't save him. He remembers the love, the pain, the bond, and still believes death is his purpose now. Especially because, as far as Gambit knows, Rogue chose Magneto over him. That's what he died thinking, and that's the sort of thing that makes a superhero story sting. Also, it connects very nicely to the comic concept about Gambit being death. In those issues, Remy doesn't become Apocalypse's horseman because he woke up evil one morning. He's vulnerable because Mystique reopens every wound around Rogue, and because the world after M-Day leaves mutant kind frightened, reduced, and desperate. The X-Men are trying to hold things together, but Remy feels unheard and displaced. Apocalypse steps in at exactly the wrong time, or from his point of view, the perfect time, and offers Gambit certainty. He offers him importance. He offers him a role in what comes next, and for a man who feels like he's losing his place and his home, that kind of offer can do serious damage. What makes the arc even more interesting is that Gambit's own explanation isn't built on hatred. He says he did it out of love for the X-Men, and he believes, at least for a while, that Apocalypse might actually be the hard answer mutant kind needs after everything has fallen apart after M-Day. He also thinks that just in case Apocalypse is still the same manipulator he always has been, then Gambit can stay close enough to watch him from the inside. It's a very Remy plan, honestly. Brave, reckless, playing both sides against each other, half smart and half doomed from the start. I mean, this is Apocalypse we're talking about, not somebody that Remy can con over a card table. The blood and the machine do the rest. Apocalypse doesn't merely recruit Gambit, changes him. He turns him into his horseman, Death. And though the conversion never fully erases who Remy was, it damages him in ways that matter. Of course, through all of that, Rogue keeps resurfacing through the fog. His conscience also survives in pieces. Apocalypse notices that and fears it enough to threaten him, and that's maybe the real tragedy here. Gambit doesn't vanish in one easy moment. Parts of him remain awake, and those parts have to witness what death does to his face, his voice, and his hands. For X-Men 97, this could sit inside Apocalypse's larger plans across time. The available Season 2 material points to a story that stretches through ancient Egypt, the present, and the future, with Apocalypse's influence active across all the different time periods. So, Gambit may become Apocalypse's weapon in the 1990s timeline, while Bishop and Forge try to bring the scattered X-Men back together. That would make his return urgent in two ways. The team has to survive Apocalypse, yes, but Rogue also has to face the possibility that saving Remy might not be as simple as finding him. As for the other Horsemen, this is where we should be careful. The comic arc used Gambit, Polaris, Sunfire, and Gazer, and Season 2 is confirmed to give Polaris a major role that affects both X-Men and X-Force. Naturally, fans will be expecting Horsemen parallels from the comics, but that doesn't mean Polaris is confirmed to be a Horseman in the show. That part stays in the speculation box, at least until the series says otherwise, and it's important to note that by the end of the comic arc, Gambit is no longer under Apocalypse's direct command, but he's also not back to being the Remy who walked into the Sphinx. He accepts the gifts of death, tries to cut away his bond with Rogue, turns from the X-Men, and chooses exile with Sunfire over return. Rogue is left with this awful image of the love of her life looking at her as if killing her would free him. That's why Death Gambit works. He's not a villain in a costume with cool design. He's Remy LeBeau, but he's been broken into a shape that can hurt everyone who loves him. And with that depressing thought, that's where we're going to end this video today. If you enjoyed this content and our efforts to bring it to you, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons, which will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these awesome videos, as well as help you tremendously in seeing more of them. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have an amazing day. Oh, and before I go, Excelsior!